Hi, Sasha. Thank you so much for joining the podcast today. How are you doing?
Hi, very well, thanks. Thanks for inviting me on.
No worries at all. We're going to talk about this question of morality today and whether it's objective. So I thought that we could start by kind of dissecting the question a little bit, if that's okay with you.
Mhm.
So when we consider this question, is morality objective? Can we think of a way to paraphrase it and sort of talk about what we're actually meaning when we ask that question?
I guess, is there something that's beyond just a matter of taste about morality? So I might talk about, uh, I love chocolate ice cream. But I think most people, when they say murder is wrong, would like to say it's a different kind of statement.
Yeah,
Well, I don't like chocolate ice cream, you know? I
yeah.
think we'd like to say that murder is just wrong and it doesn't matter who you are, it's completely wrong. But as I think we'll see in our discussion today, that's not necessarily as obvious as we might think.
Sure. Yeah, it's not as straightforward as that. For what it's worth, I think that anyone who says they don't like chocolate ice cream is very morally wrong, but there you go. But you're right, really, it is a matter of preference, isn't it? And I think we could potentially tie that in as well, like what we mean when we say specific statements and the things that we often take for granted, as philosophy shows us, are very much not necessarily that straightforward. So that's something that we can dive into. Good. So you mentioned this idea of taste and preference, which I'd like to come back to if that's okay. So that's kind of the stuff that comes to mind for me when I think about moral relativism. So maybe we can unpack that a little bit and contrast that perhaps to moral absolutism. So when we talk about moral relativism, what do we mean? What's the kind of meaning behind that term?
But I think it's always good with these terms that can sound a bit confusing when you just hear the term as a whole, the two words together, to actually
Mm,
break down what the two words are. So obviously you've
yeah.
got moral, we're probably
Hmm.
okay with that, but relativism, well, think about the word relative. So largely it would be it's relative to your culture, or maybe relative to your point in history, what is good or bad. So we might, for example, take that in the until the late 1960s, being gay was illegal in the
Hmm.
UK. Which, if
Yeah.
something's illegal, we probably assume that means it's bad, right? That's why we want it to be illegal. I'm certainly not saying that I think being gay is bad, but that
Hmm.
seems to be what the law was saying before. But then, of
Sure.
course, we changed it, and now, in fact, it's illegal to treat people as if they're bad because they're gay. So it's gone completely the other way. Um, so the question then, obviously, is: did it change from being bad to good when that law changed, or has it always been bad and we just recognized it has it been bad that it was illegal and we just recognized we were doing the wrong thing, and that
Yeah.
actually you you there's nothing wrong with being gay. We might also look at like different cultural ideas from around the world. So, for let's take an extreme example right now that's been in the news in Afghanistan. They've made it illegal for this is a very extremist version of Islam, by the way. The Taliban in Afghanistan
Hmm.
have made it illegal for women to speak in public, right? Because they're obviously saying by their moral code they believe, which I think most Muslims would not agree with this, but
Sure.
their version of Islam, their kind of the version and understanding of it,
Mm.
they are saying, it's bad for women to speak in public.
Hmm.
Um, Now, if we're being morally relative about that, we can just say, well, okay, well, that's their culture. We have to accept that. But I think most of us would probably be pretty uncomfortable with that. Um, and of course, it's kind of not surprising that moral relativism becomes a kind of outcome of the culture we live in, because we live in a country which has hundreds of different cultures, and we have this thing called multiculturalism,
Yeah.
where people have to respect the little differences they have in each other's cultures, while respecting sort of what we call fundamental British values in the education system, um,
Yeah.
which might be more than British values. But anyway, I think that's a discussion for another time. Um,
Sure.
so there's a sort of two bits here. I think there's historical relativism in terms
Hmm.
of how it looks like morality changes over time, and cultural relativism where it looks like it might be very different in different cultures, and there has to be a limit to that. There was actually Mary Midgley in 1981, who was a philosopher in 1981. She wrote something called a paper called "Trying Out One's New Sword," which was looking at the sort of limits of this. And she said, well, if we look at sort of samurai culture in Japan, in 17th century Japan, um, it was quite normal for a samurai to go and try out their new sword by finding a random member of the public and just slicing them in half. And for them, that sort of warrior ethic, they were like, well, that's fine. That's all right. We're allowed to do that. What Mary Misley is saying is, hold on a minute. If we're being culturally relativist about this, we're going to have to say that's fine. It's just different taste and preference across
Yeah.
time and cultures. I think probably most of us are pretty uncomfortable with that. And I think she was pretty uncomfortable about it and sort of used it as an example to say, hold on, there must be something underneath that is fixed, that this is breaking. And I think what she's sort of pointing to there is an objective morality, something that's beyond culture, time, and place. And
Right.
that is just always wrong.
Yes, excellent. So I think that's hit the nail on the head. This idea of it depends on the place, it depends on the culture, it depends on the time period versus the words always and never. I think that's the kind of key difference really between moral relativism and moral absolutism. So yeah, really, really good examples there that I think students can definitely benefit from hearing. I think examples are useful because it can, like you say, seem a little bit abstract otherwise. So I always think as well with the ism bit, that reflects a belief as well. So it's not just an observation, because I think we could all agree, regardless of what our stance on morality is, I think we can all look around the world and different times in history as well and say, well, people had different ideas of what's right and wrong. I think the ism bit, the ISM at the end of the term, is showing that that's a belief that that's okay, and that therefore that means there is no objective morality versus the observation. So I think it's important to kind of, yeah, talk about the difference there really. Like, you know, I, for example, could look and be like, well, you know, like the example you gave about not allowing women to speak in public, I can look and say, well, clearly that's their view on what the right thing to do is. Otherwise, presumably they wouldn't be doing it. Most people don't knowingly do the wrong thing. They think they're doing it for good reasons. But there's a difference between me looking at that and saying that's what they believe versus I believe that they're right to do that because it's up to them. And I think that's where the debate can get really, really interesting. So even if we can all agree on that observation, we can have different views about whether that's justifiable or not, and whether there is an external objective morality that, like you say, is the case regardless of time, regardless of culture. And I think it gets really difficult because you mentioned the idea that we're living in a multicultural society, and part and parcel of that oftentimes is the recognition and the kind of appreciation that not everybody agrees with you. And I think one of the arguments that moral relativists make is that, well, because we've all got different ideas, therefore there can't be an objective morality, because if there was, we'd all know what it is. So I'd love to get your opinion on that as a kind of argument in favour of moral relativism, this idea that actually there can't be an objective morality because if there was, we'd all know it and we'd all apply it in the same way.
It's interesting that actually, because I feel like a lot of the time when I state this question to students first, you know, about do you think there's an objective morality? A lot of the time they basically say, of course not. Of course there
Oh,
isn't. Because
interesting.
yeah, I get that answer a lot as if it's, you know, it's self-evident that there can't be. And I think, and I've thought about that a lot, and I think one of the reasons is growing up in this environment where there are many different moral viewpoints and we're
Yeah.
meant to respect them all and tolerate them all. I think there's a bit of confusion there between toleration and accepting that it's correct, though. You know, toleration
Yeah.
is different to accepting something.
Great
It means
point.
putting up with it, really, rather than
Exactly.
saying you're right.
Exactly. If you look at the etymology of the word, it literally means to bear, doesn't it? Like you're bearing the situation, but it doesn't mean you're happy about it.
So yeah. In any case, so they're sort of talking about how they can see how there's, you know, it seems like there's no fixed morality because there are so many different viewpoints that we have to kind of see as acceptable or or at least tolerable.
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised in many ways that young people and lots of people get confused by this and think, well, surely there can't be. Then another point, of course, is that in where we live in the world, and I think it's important to say where we live in the world, increasingly we're living in a very secularized society
Yeah.
where, you know, it almost looks a bit sort of post-religion-y really now in the UK. Obviously, for the first time in the census recently, less than half the population identified as Christian, as just one example.
Yeah.
That's a good bit for the DCT paper, that thing.
It is. Lovely synoptic link there.
Yeah, there's a lot of those in this actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that they that it's not surprising in many ways that cultural relativism is seen by many as, well, of course there's no fixed morality, because also if we look at fixed morality as well, like, I don't know, if we look at, like, let's take the Ten Commandments as an obvious example of sort of divine command theory, and there being a very definite kind of list of rules you can look at and say this is definitely right because God gave it to us. There's things in there, for example, sort of not taking God's name in vain, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And things like that, which we just wouldn't see as wrong now, or adultery, which might be seen as a sort of questionable, but you can get divorced now, at least.
Yeah.
So there's lots of, and honouring your mother and father, which again, there might be limits to that. I think if you take something like that, in a way, then it looks like moral absolutism is more straightforward. But I think as we've moved forward and people have seen the limits of that, and it doesn't necessarily apply to them, I think lots of these students and people just generally kind of go, well, surely the problem here is saying that there isn't objective morality at all, because this objective rule has changed over time. So again, surely anything can be right, really.
Like, where do we draw the line?
Yeah, a few different elements to why they think, why I think this moral relativism becomes attractive, or seems to make sense, actually. I think also what's really important with this question is to unpack the question further, which I think is always a really, really good thing to do. If we see in really high level essays, you can see people analysing the question itself, as long as they're still answering the question, I think. But if we look at actually what does objective mean?
Sorry, froze slightly there, but so defining the word objective, I think you were saying.
Yeah. What does objective actually mean? Well, I think what a lot of us would like to say it means is a truth that stays the same. That is the same in any context. It's a truth that stays the same. Now I think is the time when we start approaching people like AJ Ayer on the course, who obviously talks about verificationism, and he kind of tries to define objectivity, or fact, at least meaningful facts, as something which is either true by definition, like 1 + 1 = 2, or that bachelor is an unmarried man, or something like that. It doesn't have to be maths, it can also be language, or something that can be kind of empirically verified, even if it's maybe only potentially verified by sense evidence in the future. That's what he calls weak verification principle, right? So if it fits those two, you've got something meaningful you're talking about, potential fact. It could be objective, but everything else that's not that is meaningless, right? And I think for him, ethics falls outside of those, because actually, what do you is it true by definition? Well, some people like Kant might say yes, but I don't think AJ would be very happy about that.
No, I don't either.
But and also the other option is you might say, well, can you empirically verify it? Well, I mean, I suppose for AJA, you can't look at a thing somewhere and go, oh, that's where it says murder is wrong, or whatever ethic it might be, whatever moral code it might be. For him, you can't actually look at it, you can't find it. Hopefully we have time today for me to get onto how I think actually he might be wrong about that. There's been quite a lot of work by evolutionary biologists and things that really seems to show that it could potentially be empirically verifiable, that there is some kind of objective morality as an evolutionary adaptation, but we'll get onto that.
I'd love to, actually, because that would be a good way to challenge some of the views that he has, because obviously he's an emotivist as well, isn't he? His view is that, when we're expressing these statements, rather than saying murder is objectively wrong, which is what we might think we're saying, what we're actually saying is, like, if we call it the boo hurrah theory, so it's like boo murder, I don't like murder. And that's very different to saying a kind of empirically meaningful statement. And the other thing I think is important to say is that when we say, I think students often get confused between meaningful and meaningless. And they sometimes think like, oh, well, if these scholars are saying the statement's meaningless, then therefore it shouldn't be said. And it's like, it's not quite that. I think they mean it in a more kind of scientific respect. Because obviously the people that say these things, it's very meaningful to them, in the sense it has value. But yeah, sorry, go ahead. This idea that evolutionary biology can challenge that idea? Do you want to sort of like delve into that now? Actually, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, so just looking at, I always think of AJ Ayer as the boo hurrah thing as a sort of bit of a pantomime sounding thing.
It is a bit,
It's
yeah.
sort of cheering and going against it. Um, but I mean, what he said basically is they're just statements of emotion.
Yeah.
And when I'm saying murder is wrong, what I'm really saying is it has the same kind of content as saying I really hate chocolate ice cream. It's actually the
Yes.
same kind of statement.
Mm.
So I think what's happened is a lot of development with evolutionary biology. I mean, it did actually start with Darwin, right back in the 19th century, obviously sort of famous for putting forward our modern theories of evolution and everything. Um, Now, Darwin did write this book later called The Descent of Man,
Hmm.
which talks about the development of humankind. And he very much makes clear that he's just hypothesizing, which means basically you're just putting forward a conjecture or an idea to
Yeah.
be tested later on. He's not saying, I think this is definitely true, but he's sort of sitting there going, no, I see all these different animals, working together and looking after each other. And they seem to be successful when they live in groups. So surely that explains how being kind to each other is quite a good adaptation. Um,
Yes.
and that for sort of animals living in big groups is quite a good adaptation to actually
Hmm.
care about each other. Which is it's still self-interested because it's like, well, I'm going to survive best. And later on, of course, Darwin didn't really know about genes yet, but later on, someone like Richard Dawkins obviously pops up a bit on the course as well.
Quite a bit, yeah.
Wrote, wrote the selfish gene, where he does talk about. I always think it would be better to call it the self-interested gene, but anyway, he
Yeah,
talks about
he's even said the title's been misunderstood quite a lot, I think.
yeah, because selfish is obviously negative, but actually, if you think self-interested, why is that such a bad thing for me to want to look after myself and those close to me?
I
It's not
agree.
at the expense of other people. Obviously, it's not great, maybe.
Yeah.
But in any case, the idea is that one way of being genetically successful and surviving and those close to you surviving is to make closer relationships, to make sure that you look like you're looking after someone else and you are
Hmm.
genuinely looking after them. And that slowly that's become a natural instinct with humans and other animals too, other primates particularly, but other animals that live in groups. Darwin talks about seeing it in all kinds of animals. Um, and also, there's a guy called Kropotkin who's kind of an early anarchist and anthropologist, so 19th century Russian guy who's an early anarchist and anthropologist, and he talked about mutual aid, which was this idea that he said that there was anthropological evidence from humans that actually those successful groups were the people who looked after each other, and that
Yeah.
he found various bits of what he said were evidence for that.
Yes.
Um, so in any case, the point is that one explanation for morality existing could be that it's a good evolutionary adaptation. And obviously, one way of getting that proof is from empirical means. Let's go back to
Sure.
that. One of the
Yeah.
things it says is we can see something as meaningful if it's empirically verifiable. Well, here we are. It might be empirically verifiable. And there's been a lot of work done by evolutionary biologists. There's another couple, Matt Ridley and Robin Dunbar as well,
Hmm.
have more recently done things. So Matt Ridley wrote this book in 1996 called The Origins of Virtue,
Okay.
where he uses all kinds of different scientific, mathematical modeling evidence, all kinds of things to talk about how, well, obviously you can hear from the title, virtue, how it's
Yes.
come about that people have kind of had things like the golden rule.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, the golden rule, of course, being like treat others as you wish to be treated,
Mm.
which is in Christianity is Jesus' greatest commandment or God's
Hmm.
greatest commandment. Um, and of course, you do find versions of it in all major religions.
Yes, which is interesting, isn't it? Because it
Yeah,
seems to be something that is universal. And if you extend that, but potentially objective as well, it seems to be something that at the very least different cultures can agree on, even if they don't always play it out in that particular way, and there are things that are potentially conflicting there. But absolutely, I think, when you've been talking about genes and what you can observe in animals as well, we could potentially apply that to humans, and therefore that would be empirically verifiable. I know that a lot of work has been done into altruism. So for those wondering, altruism is essentially when you do something that's good for others, but often to your own expense. So, for example, sacrificing your life for the benefit of those around you, obviously that's going to harm you. And it seems very counterintuitive. If we do have this survival instinct, which we do seem to have, why would we be willing to sacrifice ourselves so that others can survive? But you could bring it down to genes, really, couldn't you? This idea that actually, even if you don't survive, the genes in your relatives will. So it's better that you would kind of, and you can see that with monkeys. Like if a monkey calls out, I think the example uses if a leopard's there, the monkey gives a warning call to the other monkeys, like, you know, run away, get away. But in the monkey that makes the call attracts the leopard to them, and therefore, you know, they're endangering their lives, but there's a reason behind it. There's method to it, if that makes sense. So, and it's the same with psychology, you know, so both in biology and psychology, there are observations about how we develop morally. And I'm thinking in particular of Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development. I know not everyone kind of fully agrees with these as being a useful model, but it is quite interesting how, you know, the kind of bottom level, the reasons why we do things is to kind of avoid punishment. That's kind of like the very, very basic first stage. And then it develops until eventually, ideally, we would get to a point where we can look at it on principle and look and actually think through empathy. And that does tie back to the golden rule, really. Like, just think about what you're doing. And if other people, because I think Confucius said something very similar, he said, like, don't do to other people what you wouldn't want done to yourself, which is basically a paraphrasing of the golden rule, if you think about it. And yet he's coming from a completely different culture in a different part of the world. So it does seem to point to this, this objective morality. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to think about maybe where that comes from. So we've talked a little bit about the scientific side, but for those that maybe are skeptical of the idea that actually we've just evolved to be good and have this concept of morality, can you think of any other potential sources of morality that we might turn to or that we might think are applicable here?
Yeah, I think it's on the back of that, it's worth just bouncing off the idea that one critique of saying evolutionary biology can show how there's objective morality would be, well, it's not really objective then, is it?
Yeah.
Because it's not fixed. It's actually become an adaptation for specifically beings living in large groups, it seems like. So
True. And it could again change, couldn't it, further down the line if we continue to change and evolve?
Yeah, so therefore, I suppose where would the sources of objective morality be if we do reject that as an answer?
Yeah.
And obviously, we can talk about God.
Yeah.
We can talk about metaphysical sources.
Mm-hmm.
We could even talk, I mean, in some ways, like Buddhism is interesting because obviously it doesn't really require a god.
Yeah.
There are obviously types of Buddhism that do have gods, but you know, it doesn't necessarily require a god. And it seems almost like it does start from kind of an empirical basis of, you know, the Buddha going out and seeing all these people suffering and going, isn't that awful? Sorry, that's a
Yeah.
very basic version of Buddhism. Sorry to all the specialists out there,
That's fine.
but it's just interesting that there is a kind of empirical basis that just pops into my head. But I think, yeah, obviously we can get sources like God or gods and divine command theory. So you can get very set sources like Ten Commandments, Moses bringing it down from God, or somebody like Jesus putting forward the greatest commandment. All the Abrahamic ideas that seem to be very sort of commanding, and it's definite and it's written down and you can follow these rules, actually potentially particularly in Islam, where
Yeah.
obviously the Quran is copied very faithfully down the ages. There's other ideas as well that, I mean, of course, the limit of that is that you have to actually have that faith
True. It's a
to
bit
believe
meaningless
that.
otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah, so which is fine, obviously, but it's tricky because it might leave a lot of other people who don't have that faith that saying, well, why should I be moral? Which is kind of what I think, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre drew on the kind of words of Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov. Who's a Russian author in the 19th century who I think pops up on the OCR spec now and again.
Yeah, I think you're right.
He talks about how, like, if God is dead, everything is permitted. So we also have this problem where if we enter into an atheistic or secular age, suddenly we have no source for morality. Well, God's not telling me to do it because God doesn't exist. So why should I? I'll just grab that car and take it because I want it and kill the owner of it because I want to keep their car. Why not? You know?
Yeah.
So there's also, that's quite brittle. You know, if you don't have God there, if you don't have belief in God, then you might be in trouble. Or someone like Nietzsche, of course, 19th century German philosopher, saw it as, he called it kind of slave morality as well, where, you know, being meek and God favoring the meek and all this kind of thing is just encouraging weakness and this kind of thing. And that actually, might is right, essentially. It's my very simple version of Nietzsche, and the Übermensch and all this kind of thing, which obviously a
Yeah,
bit of a twisted version the Nazis really drew on. I
sure.
don't think
Yeah.
Nietzsche himself was particularly anti-Semitic, but the
A
Nazi
lot of these
people.
ideas get appropriated, don't they?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's lots of different, there's potential sources there, but potential problems with them. There's someone like Philippa Foot as well, who wrote in a book Natural Goodness, who was actually kind of contemporary of A.J. Ayer, and
Mm.
unsurprisingly didn't really get on with him very well. Um, she definitely did think that there was set morality that sort of based it on Aristotelian ideas of teleology and thinking that, we should, if we're well developed and if we're suitable, we'll work well. So again, a very simple version of Aristotelian ideas, but
Sure, virtue ethics as well, which I think used to be on the spec, if I remember rightly, but is no longer, which is a shame because I'm quite a big fan of that actually. This idea
yeah,
that it's something you can cultivate. It's not necessarily a fixed thing in the way that someone like Kant might argue, but it's something that you can actually develop through habit and practice and things like that. And I guess you've got humanists as well, because one thing you were talking about is the kind of this idea that if God is dead, everything is permissible. I guess that's where humanists to an extent come in, and they say, well, actually, we shouldn't be referring to this external source of authority. We need to look within us to work out what the right thing to do is. But then, of course, the problem is that doesn't seem to be objective really, because everybody, again, as we've observed, has different ideas. Maybe that's where, though, we could bring something in like the conscience and refer to my background. That's the kind of classic cartoon image really that you get sometimes of the conscience, right? You've got the angel on one shoulder, the devil on the other, which granted is still a religious thing, but I think even many atheists would concede that there is a conscience. Now, granted, they might not, well, obviously would not see it as the voice of God. They might see it as something altogether different, but yeah, I mean, could we look at the conscience potentially as a source of morality?
yeah, it seems to be fixed, doesn't it? And it, so we might take people sometimes sort of take extreme examples to try and disprove things. So
Mm.
like somebody might take a psychopath and say, what about them? But the thing is, we call psychopaths because we see them as there's something wrong with them, right?
Yeah,
They have a
exactly.
conscience working, and we see that as a kind of illness. We wouldn't like to see that as healthy. And I think just the fact that we see it as that does show that there is some kind of fixed conscience. And I mean,
Mm.
I'd argue that that links back again to this kind of evolutionary development of it being a pretty good idea to treat other people as you want to be treated. But
Yeah.
again, coming back to the original question, is morality objective? There's the problems we've already mentioned about maybe that means it's not objective anyway, because it's just an adaptation and that may change. But
Mm-hmm.
also there's the idea that it's actually very narrow too. I mean, if if the only thing that we can show is that it's a good idea to have what I think it's called reciprocal altruism,
Yeah.
where where you do to others as you wish to be done to you, and that's where we're sort of kind to each other, and that's the only moral rule that could be seen as quite limited, and there could be
Mm.
like so many different interpretations of what that actually means that it almost becomes meaningless. And I think we've even seen the dangers of that happening sometimes with group violence and things like that.
Yeah.
Um, that there's a thing called kin altruism, which is where you care. I think you might have mentioned it earlier, actually, but you care more about your close family members and things like that. But also, you care more about people who look like you or act like you. So,
Yeah.
football hooligans might be an example of that. Or in Nazi Germany would be the obvious extreme example. The recent riots, stemming from the issues in Southport,
Mm-hmm.
there's murders in Southport that happened, and this kind of far right violence where or people calling immigrants cockroaches, this kind of thing, and seeing people who don't look like you or have the same culture as you as somehow less human and a danger to be repelled or watched
Yeah.
out for, and therefore you could see caring for those close to you as attacking those other people and treating them as less than human. So
That's a good point. And a lot of people would, I think, very justifiably say that that's immoral, even if it's natural. So I think
yeah,
there's a
yeah.
gap between what we consider to be natural, moral, and legal, even. Because you used that
Mm,
example right at the beginning of how there seems to have been a 180 done when it comes to, for example, gay rights. It was only like the 1960s, I think it was 1967, when homosexuality between men was decriminalized, but it still wasn't accepted. It's only been sort of like in recent decades that's happened. But it's like, yeah, again, was that always wrong, or was it something that we kind of changed? Like, did our standards of morality change? And it's a tricky one to say the least.
yeah.
um Yeah. Great. Well, I feel like we could talk about this for ages, but we've come to the end now. Where should people go to find out more about your resources that you're planning to release soon?
Well, I've just started kind of making an online presence of it because I'm
Mhm.
just finding about that world. I'm on Facebook, so if you search the COG on Facebook, you will find my page. I've started tentatively starting a TikTok page as well. With I'm trying
Nice.
to put sort of bite-sized thoughts or bite-sized bits of advice, 60, 90-second bits of advice on there. And that's you can find that at CogTalk, which is COGTOK 2024. So 2024. Um,
Fantastic.
and I'm on email as well, um, which you can find via that Facebook page.
Brilliant.
Um,
Okay, brilliant. Good stuff. I will put those links in the notes so that students can go and access it. I think that bite-size approach is actually really, really helpful because sometimes some students will want a deeper dive, others will just want the kind of, headline sort of like top level stuff. So I think that's a really good way to do it. And of course, TikTok seems to be the platform that everybody's on now, more or less. So yeah, there you go. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Sasha. And hopefully we can talk about morality in more detail another time. Actually, it'd be great to have you back on to explore maybe specific things that we deem to be moral or immoral, actually. So specific areas that we could potentially look at and different views on those from an ethical as well as a meta-ethical standpoint. But yeah, in the meantime, thank you very, very much. And yeah, have a lovely rest of the day.
thanks very much for having me on.
No
Thank you.
worries. Cheers.
Bye.